Hi, my name is Alan McConnell, and I'm a professor of psychology at Miami University. Today we're going to spend a few minutes to take a look at a paper that my colleagues and I published on the health benefits of pet ownership. And we're going to study this paper for a couple of reasons. First, the paper will provide us with an opportunity to discuss the various sections involved in a scientific paper and why they're organized in the way that they are. Secondly, and at a broader level, thinking about this particular paper will allow us to talk about the process by which scientists go about asking questions and developing studies that allow them to address those questions. So how do they come up with a particular methodology? What sort of inferential approaches do they take to answer questions? We'll discuss some of those issues through this particular paper as an illustration of those processes. As we move along, there are a few resources that are available for you that you should take advantage of. First are the PDF of our paper that's available to you, so you can take a look at the actual paper that was published in the scientific journal and follow along as we move along as well. Secondly, there are some questions that are posed on this website that you should read before you begin this video and that you should reflect on after viewing the video that will help you get the most out of this experience. And lastly, as we move along, if at any point you need to pause, whether it's to look back at the paper or to reflect on the questions a bit more, you can always hit the pause button here on the video, and you can stop me for a few minutes, and then when you're ready to come back, press the button again, and I'll be right here. So let's go ahead and get started.
So let's begin with an overview of the research process by examining the PETS paper. The research process can be broken down into 5 steps, with the first step being identifying your question of interest. This is the phenomenon that you want to understand. So for example, maybe you're an elementary school teacher and you want to increase recycling in your classroom and you have ideas about different sorts of approaches that may be more or less effective. Or maybe you're in a coral reef and you just want to understand what species of fish is most populous there. The second step is to examine the existing research literature for theories and findings that are relevant to your question. No question exists in a vacuum, but instead it's informed by past research. You might learn things about methodologies or particular sorts of statistics that make sense, and various theories can help guide you to give you justification for the sort of predictions that you might make. A third step is to choose an appropriate design and methodology, and clearly this will be informed by the question that you're trying to answer. If you want to understand species of fish, you'll obviously have to be out somewhere in a coral reef, but you may have to come up with some sort of systematic way to count fish. Maybe you can count individual fish, or maybe there are so many that you have to come up with some other approach that is systematic that allows you to deal with schools rather than individuals. The fourth step is to conduct the study. So you may be out in the field, or you may engage in archival research, such as using census data or pre-existing questionnaires to answer the questions that you're interested in. The last step is to analyze your data and interpret the findings. So all of your observations ultimately become quantified in some sort of way, and often you have to engage in statistical approaches to come up with interpretations of your data that are statistically justified and appropriate. Now let's take a look at the PETS paper. This paper has 3 experiments, with each experiment trying to tackle an important question. The first study will look at whether or not pet owners are better off than non-owners in terms of health and well-being outcomes. The second study looks at who benefits more from pet ownership. That is, if pet owners do benefit, can we determine which pet owners benefit the most? And lastly, the third study will try to causally demonstrate that pet ownership produces positive outcomes for owners. Because the first 2 studies are correlational in nature, we can't tell whether or not pets cause these outcomes unless we manipulate that particular cause and demonstrate that in a controlled study. Every paper starts with an introduction to talk about the existing literature and relevant theories that help to frame the current work. The current paper on pets talked about 3 main lines of research. One of them shows that people facing severe health challenges benefit more from pet ownership, but the introduction also noted that no one had really ever explored everyday people, which is one of the points of the current study. Another line of work talked about how social support is critical for people's happiness, health, and mortality. And lastly, a third line of research was summarized, talking about how people report feeling very connected to their pets, and that past research has shown that when people are made to feel lonely, they anthropomorphize their pets. That is, they perceive them as having human characteristics. When you put these 3 pieces of research together, you get the idea that we don't know a lot about everyday people, but social support is really important for happiness and health, and it seems as if people build up their pets to be good sources of social support when they feel lonely. And these 3 elements are at the foundation of the current work. Now let's turn to study 1, and we're going to return to the 5 basic questions that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. The particular question under examination in Study 1 is, are pet owners better off than non-owners? So again, we start by choosing an appropriate design and methodology. This particular study used a web-based questionnaire that was completed by people who were pet owners and people who were not pet owners. It used standard measures of well-being, such as measures of depression, self-esteem, physical illnesses, and other measures that have been used in the literature. Rather than inventing our own measures, we were able to find measures that are standardized and well accepted in the literature and use them in the current study. Relatedly, we also measured people's personalities, again using standard measures from the literature. And lastly, we assessed a bunch of issues that were related to pet-related measures in particular. Here we weren't able to find a lot of existing measures, and as a result, we had to invent some of these on our own. But in general, you're always better off if you can find existing measures and instruments in the literature rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So next we'll look and analyze the data before we can interpret the findings. When we think about statistics, there are two types of statistics to bear in mind, and the first type of statistics are descriptive statistics. These descriptive statistics describe central tendency and variability data. So often these are issues like mean and standard deviation, and these data were presented in Table 1 in the first two columns of the paper. So as we look at Table 1 from the paper, the area that's circled in red are the descriptive statistics, the mean and the standard deviations for the well-being measures, which is the top part, the first several rows, personality factors, the middle rows, and attachment style endorsement, the bottom rows. If you want to learn more about these measures, please consult the paper. Now when we talk about descriptive statistics, we're not answering any questions yet about whether pet owners have more of these factors than non-pet owners or what things predict these. This is just providing the reader with a general sense of what these variables look like in our entire study. So now that we've looked at the descriptives, the next question is looking at correlational measures, and this shows us how things relate. In other words, can we predict one variable, say x, from knowing another variable like y? We might be able to predict, for example, people's weight by knowing how tall they are, knowing that on average people who are taller tend to weigh more. So to look at the correlational data in the current study, we'll look at Table 1, columns 3 through 8. The area that's circled here are the correlations for Study 1. This is a large table, and each of these values indicate the ability for each of these variables to predict another variable. Values can range here for correlations from -1, a perfect negative correlation, to +1, a perfect positive correlation. We don't know whether any given correlation is statistically significant unless we conduct inferential tests. So this is what moves us from descriptives to inferential tests. In other words, any value here may or may not be meaningful, and that can vary for a lot of factors, such as how big is our sample size. So here, the values that have an asterisk or two asterisks are basically viewed to be statistically meaningful. That is, the probability that they are a fluke or a type 1 error is less than 5%. Finally, we can move to the question of central interest in Study 1, which is to see whether there are differences between pet owners and non-pet owners. Because we have two groups here, owners and non-owners, we'll use a t-test to compare the means to see whether there are reliable differences, and these are presented in Table 2. Now as we move to Table 2, we can take a look at the means for owners and non-owners in all these variables and see if the differences observed are statistically reliable or meaningful, or if the differences are so small that they might be due to chance given the sample size that we have and the amount of error in our measures. As we can see here, some of these differences are meaningful. If you look at the far right column, the t-test compares the means for the two groups, and when you see an asterisk or a dagger, we have evidence that the difference is meaningful. So the green arrows that you see on the screen between the owners and non-owners are statistically meaningful differences. The ones in gray are not statistically reliable. So even though our eye might suggest in some cases that there are differences, the statistics do not support that conclusion given the current sample. So now that we've conducted our statistical analyses and have analyzed the data, we move to the final stage, which is interpreting the findings. This is where we take the statistical significant findings and then basically think about our original questions in English rather than in statistics. And in this particular case for Study 1, we found that on some, but not all variables, pet owners were better off than non-owners. So for example, they showed evidence of greater self-esteem and greater evidence of exercise. So when we return to the question of Study 1, yes, on some dimensions, pet owners were better off than non-owners. So let's turn to Study 2. Study 1 showed that pet owners enjoy some benefits more than non-owners, but Study 2 asked a different question. Who benefits more from pet ownership? The introduction provides some background to remind readers that better social support overall predicts better well-being. Thus, the focus of Study 2 is on whether one's pet can serve such a role. Specifically, it's hypothesized that when one's pet provides better social support, its owner should enjoy greater well-being. So our next step is to choose an appropriate design and methodology. We once again surveyed dog owners on the internet using a web-based survey. We used the same measures of well-being from Study 1. This allows us to feel good about comparisons between the two studies, and since these are well-used measures, we can also feel good about how they relate to past findings that are published in the literature. We assess people's sense of social support using a social needs fulfillment measure, both with respect to human sources and their dog for social needs fulfillment. And lastly, we assess people's personalities about their dog using a measure of dog personality. We're not going to go into those hypotheses in the current presentation, but if you're interested in them, you can read the paper and learn more about them. So the descriptives are presented in the table, but let's go ahead and focus on the particular predictions here for Study 2 in terms of our data analyses, which is going to be looking at correlations between human social support, dog social support, and the extent to which these predict well-being. And these are presented in Table 4, columns 1 and 2. So in Table 4, we're going to take a look at the correlations between human social support and dog social support and each's ability to predict well-being. So we're going to focus on the area inside the red circle. And what the correlations show us is both human social support and dog social support increase, the participants reported less depression, less loneliness, greater self-esteem, greater subjective happiness, and less perceived stress. Again, this is where the sign of the correlation matters. Negative means as social support goes up, you see less of the variable. Positive correlations, as social support goes up, you see more of that variable. The other two variables involving physical illnesses and exercise and fitness did not show a statistically meaningful relationship. So the analyses for Study 2 demonstrated that there were correlations showing that as people's human social support and people's dog social support increased, participants reported better well-being. There are other correlations presented in the paper that explain what predicts the extent to which people have dog social support, and you can refer to the paper for more details on these hypotheses. So as we interpret the findings from Study 2, we found that better human social support predicted greater well-being, and this replicates a lot of past research. We also found that better dog social support predicted well-being as well, and this was a brand new finding. So to return to the question that motivated Study 2, overall, pet owners benefit more from pets that provide greater social support for them. Finally, we turn to Study 3. Here we're going to address the question of whether pets cause better outcomes. The introduction for Study 3 reminds readers that Studies 1 and 2 were correlational in nature, and thus we don't know if pets cause better outcomes for their owners. As you probably remember from your research methods classes, correlation does not imply causation. To show causality, we need an experimental design where we manipulate the presumed cause to show it produced the outcome. And in the current work, we're going to borrow from past research from the literature that has used a social rejection manipulation. In this past research, they brought people into the lab and made them write for 5 minutes about a time in their life when they were socially rejected, and this makes them feel socially isolated. After they do that for 5 minutes, you give them a second experience to see how that second experience helps to neutralize the negativity that came from that experience of social rejection. So we're relying on past methodologies from the literature to help us answer the causality question in the current study. So in Study 3, we brought pet owners in the lab where we could control their experiences to a greater degree than we could on the internet. The very first thing we did was we measured their initial social needs feelings. This is using a standard questionnaire that assesses the people's sense of social connectedness. Afterwards, based on random assignment conditions, some participants were made to feel socially rejected while others were not. Those people in the social rejection condition wrote about, for 5 minutes, a time in their life when they felt socially rejected. The control condition spent 5 minutes writing about what they did yesterday. Immediately after this, participants had a second task where they wrote for 5 minutes. Some participants wrote about their pet for 5 minutes, other participants wrote about their best friend for 5 minutes, and a third condition, the control condition, drew a campus map for 5 minutes. Immediately after that, they completed the very same social needs feeling questionnaire that they did at the beginning of the experiment, so we have a final measure that we can compare to their initial measure to see how they felt socially connected at the end of the experiment relative to the beginning. The basic idea here is that the people who did the social rejection manipulation should feel bad, but then the critical question is whether or not thinking about their pet helped to offset that negativity. So the design of Study 3 is much more complicated than Study 1, where we just had one independent variable with two levels, that is whether or not people were pet owners or not. The current study had a 2 by 3 factorial design. That is, any given person was in one of 6 cells. The first independent variable was the social rejection manipulation that had two levels, either social rejection or the control condition where they wrote about their day yesterday. The second independent variable was the second writing activity, whether they then, after that first manipulation, wrote about their pet for 5 minutes, their best friend for 5 minutes, or in the control condition, drew a map of campus. So we have a 2 by 3 factorial design. Now we're interested in whether there are meaningful differences among these conditions. And because we have a design with 6 different conditions, the 2 by 3, we have to use an analysis of variance, or an ANOVA, to test for differences between these conditions. A t-test will help us look for differences between 2 conditions, but because we have 6 here and they're organized in a factorial way, we need a more powerful test, in this case the ANOVA. So if you look on page 1249 of the paper, you'll see the text describing the ANOVA, which is shown here on the left, and the graph, figure 1, that displays the findings in a graphical form. You'll see 6 bars in figure 1 organized in the 2 by 3 design that I just described to you, and again, you can read more details about this in the paper. So from this ANOVA and the graph that's presented here, we can think about interpreting 3 different outcomes. The first outcome is this. People felt good at the end of the experiment compared to the beginning when they were not socially rejected. If you look at the 3 bars on the left side of this graph, the people in the control condition, these are the people who did not feel social rejection, and their feelings at the end of the experiment were relatively positive compared to the beginning. The y-axis here shows a different score about their social needs fulfillment at the end compared to the beginning. Larger scores mean that they felt relatively good at the end of the experiment. However, turning to the second point, the people who experienced the social rejection condition but only got to draw a map afterwards, that's the black bar on the far right side, felt the worst. That bar is way below 0, which means they felt especially bad at the end of the experiment compared to the beginning. This basically demonstrates that our rejection manipulation had its effect, and that when people got nothing to do afterwards but just draw a campus map, they felt pretty bad after thinking for 5 minutes about a rejection experience back earlier in their life. The most important conditions, though, are the 2 bars to the left of that black bar. These are the people who experienced social rejection, but afterwards either got to write about their pet, the white bar, or got to write about their best friend, the gray bar. These people felt good in the wake of social rejection because they had something positive in terms of social support to reflect on. So in particular with this study, the white bar shows us that when following a social rejection experience, thinking about your pet offset the negativity compared to the people who only got to think about the map. So this causally demonstrates that thinking about your pet can help offset social rejection negativity. We now come to the final section of the paper, the general discussion. This outlines the take-home points across all the studies. And in the current paper, there were 3 studies, and the overall take-home points were these. Study 1 showed that when differences existed, pet owners were better off than non-owners. There were no cases where pet owners fared worse than non-owners did. Study 2 showed that owners who had pets that provided greater social needs support were better off with the social support, and that the social support complemented human social support. It was an independent source of social support that made their lives better. And finally, Study 3 used an experiment where we randomly assigned people to conditions to show that thinking about one's pet offset the negativity that comes from social rejection. It's just like thinking about your best friend. So in the wake of social rejections, pets can actually reduce the negativity that people experience. Okay, well that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you've learned a lot about how research papers are organized and about how that structure reflects the way that scientists engage in the research enterprise. Over the years, you'll be reading a lot of research papers when you develop your projects and learning more about your various topics of interest, and hopefully some of the research that you conduct will itself get published in this literature and inform people for years to come. The last activity we'd like for you to engage in here, related to this video, is to reflect on some questions that appear on the screen. And at some point you may need to hit the pause button to keep these questions on the screen, depending on how you're viewing this video. In particular, we'd like for you to reflect on this video, not only with respect to some of the specific things that I covered during the course of the video, but to also have you reflect on how it might inform your inquiry action projects. Well, that's it. Thank you for your attention and have a great day.